Hello everybody, I'm Barry Cooper, one half of Cooper Cary Have Words. I'm here in Epsom, England. Why? What did you think I was going to say? And approximately, how many miles away are you now, James, do you think? A couple of hundred?
About 95.
95,
maybe?
and 95 miles away from me in Yeovil, Somerset, is James Cary. How is Storm Eunice treating you, James?
Well, it's just blown through. It's just blown the top off a church in Wells, St Thomas's. But I'm thinking that it's coming your way, Barry. But by Floridian standards, this is a mild breeze.
It's not too bad. I walked down to the mini store, and there was definitely some wheelie bin damage had occurred, but that was about it. So I didn't get too excited. So that's why I've got a nice chintzy background. This is not going to be my background from now on. It's just that I happen to be at my dad's place recording today. So if the sound sounds slightly different, that's why as well. So apologies for that. James, our church live stream is something that God would be pleased with. Can you take the Lord's Supper remotely? And would it be okay if you didn't have bread and wine to use Doritos and Tizer? And if not, why not? How are you making
I've got some for you.
Good, hit it.
So, should we celebrate Christmas? And should we just sing psalms? And do we need to sully those psalms with fetid and awful musical instruments? And if we do, are we just using organs or can we use modern guitars? So these are all similar questions to the funky new ones that you've posed. Why are we considering these questions, Barry?
Well, we're talking about the regulative principle, and we realise that for many of our listeners that might be something of a new term. Maybe it would be helpful to define what we mean by the regulative principle. It's something that has been a feature in a great many Reformed churches since the Reformation. And the definition, this is coming from Dr. Derek Thomas at Ligonier. He said, put simply, the regulative principle of worship states that the corporate worship of God is to be founded upon specific directions of Scripture. In other words, in our worship services, we should only do things that are specifically mandated by Scripture or by good and necessary consequence can be deduced from Scripture. I'm using the Westminster Confession of Faith wording there. So that's basically it. Have I got that right?
I think so, yeah. This has been swirling around in the back of my head for a while, so I'm pleased that I've had to now basically do a bit of research so that we can talk about it. And I used to think of it slightly erroneously as the regulative principle is we only do what the Bible says we can do, rather than we shouldn't do what the Bible says we shouldn't do, which are obviously two different things. Now, where that came from, sorry, I'm coughing, by the way, because I have COVID. So that's why also Barry and I, despite being in the same country now, can't be in the same room, which is crazy, isn't it? But there we go. Because I heard Ligon Duncan explain very helpfully on a video that I watched how this sort of came about in the sense of we had a Roman church for 1,000 years, 1,500 years, doing worship in a way that was changing but generally fairly static, but based on tradition as much as what the Bible teaches. Then the Lutherans came along and wanted to reform it. And so rather than just throw everything out and start all over again, they were trying to remove from the worship service things that they felt Scripture says that you really shouldn't do. But then the next phase of the reformers, the Calvinists and such like, said, no, you've got to kind of be much more rigorous in only having what Scripture allows. And then you've got the kind of the extra bonus faction here, which are the Anabaptists, who are pretty much burn it all down and start all over again. You can tell how I feel about Anabaptism from my description of it. But these are all kind of different approaches to what we do when we gather to worship. And it's much more specifically about worship than how we live our lives day to day. So it is the regulative principle of worship. Have I done any great violence to the definition there, Barry?
No, and I think that's great. And what's helpful as well is to talk about another principle, which usually the regulative principle is contrasted with, which is the so-called normative principle. So the normative principle, if I'm understanding right, is the idea that anything that is not expressly forbidden by Scripture can be used in corporate worship. So using musical instruments, for example, would be fine. They're not forbidden by Scripture. And this is the way that most modern evangelical churches would go, I think. I think by default, we're probably normative principle people. Drama sketches aren't forbidden by Scripture, so they're fine. Movie clips aren't forbidden, that's fine. Performative dancing, and apart,
if you must,
if you insist, and also,
just don't ask me to join in.
Yeah, quite. That's the reason I don't do it. It's nothing to do with the regulative principle. And another one would be things like the sort of vestments that a pastor would wear, because there's no particular vestment that is expressly forbidden by Scripture. You can pretty much wear what you like, right? That's kind of the idea. And so there is a sort of a third way, which I've heard about, which might be helpful. It's kind of a slight amendment to the regulative principle. This is something that Peter Leithart talks about. It's kind of like an adaptation. He says a more helpful way to apply the regulative principle is to think in terms of analogies. So are there particular analogies in Scripture which you can kind of extrapolate from and say, actually, I think that is a biblical justification for the sort of thing we have in mind here for a worship service. So that's quite an interesting take. He's written a book called From Silence to Song, The Davidic Liturgical Revolution. So that's worth a read if you're into this sort of thing. I mean, we actually have kind of crossed over in terms of the denominational streams that we're a part of now, James. But where do you lean on this? Do you have any particularly strong feelings one way or the other?
I think there's always that temptation is to go to the purity test, which I sort of bang on about a fair amount on this, is to say, I have really high standards of Scripture. Therefore, if it's not in Scripture, I'm not doing it. I want to be pure to what Scripture says. And that, if you're young, restless and reformed, and I'm not young anymore, I'm 46. There's that temptation to go, it must be commended by Scripture and Scripture alone. So there's that temptation to go with it. But then the more you dig into it, the less practical that is, because there are an awful lot of things that aren't stipulated. For example, should you preach naked? Well, it doesn't tell you to wear clothes whilst you're preaching. Should people at the service be sitting down or standing up? Well, again, it's not. So if we're being real purists about this, then there isn't really quite enough to go on to be practical, and therefore we have to use, godly wisdom and biblical principles. But I think we want to be careful.
Just to say on that, before we go on, I think that's where the Puritans were coming from when they have that phrase about good and necessary consequence can be deduced from Scripture. So the preaching naked thing, they would probably say, well, there's stuff in Scripture about modesty, and therefore this would apply. But yes, I mean, I take your point. I think it does seem to me that two people who are even quite strict regulative principle people could, in theory, apply the regulative principle in slightly different ways. So, yes, it seems like there's maybe more wiggle room here than some of the super purists might think.
So I think you're right, there's wiggle room, but I just worry that we sometimes let ourselves off the hook a bit. And so I'm just mindful, going through Exodus at the moment, of the meticulous instructions that God is giving Moses on Sinai about the tabernacle and what colours should be used in the threads and how often there should be loops and the gold clasps and the gold rings. And when people don't get it right, there are problems. There's that whole strange fire incident in Leviticus. And there's also the Ark of the Covenant, which is touch it and you die. Yeah. Well, I didn't mean to touch it. You're dead. I don't care. Don't touch it. And so therefore I have a general concern that we don't give God the reverence and awe that is fitting. And therefore, therefore I think we should probably be a bit more scrupulous about what our Sunday morning gatherings are for. So having said that, the idea that we don't celebrate Christmas because we're not specifically told to do so in the Bible, which is true, we're not told to celebrate Christmas in the Bible. That doesn't mean we can't or shouldn't do it. It almost seems bizarre not to. But I don't know. Would you be concerned about our reverence and awe for God in gathered worship?
Yeah, of course, although you raise a whole wrinkle there about to what extent you apply the Old Testament when you're working out the regulative principle. The hardline guys would just say, no, what we're talking about when we're talking about explicitly commanded in Scripture is we're talking about explicitly mandated by Christ or the apostles in the New Testament. So that's another little kind of, if you like, subdivision of the regulative principle camp. And again, that seems to be up for, there's been plenty of debate about that. To what extent do we take our lead from David, for example? I mean, there are clearly instruments, praise him on the lyre. You look in the Psalms, well then, on what grounds do you say, well, we're not having musical instruments? Answer, well, because it's not explicitly mandated in the New Testament. That's why. Actually, Spurgeon was... Can
I say, before you hit Spurgeon, I was just going to say, the explicit, exclusive psalmody, which I believe is what you're referring to, is like churches which only sing psalms and nothing else and don't use instruments. And there aren't many of them, but there are some. To be singing a psalm which mentions musical instruments but not have musical instruments, I mean, that's kind of funny, isn't it? I mean, that's a bit odd to be singing about praising God and the musical instruments and then
one of our
that.
patrons, Tim, mentioned that, and I think that's an interesting point. Spurgeon was against the use of musical instruments, although not really hardline. His comment on that was when looking at that phrase, "Praise the Lord with harp." His comment is, men need all the help they can get to stir them up to praise. This is the lesson to be gathered from the use of musical instruments under the old dispensation. Israel was at school and used childish things to help her to learn. But in these days, when Jesus gives us spiritual manhood, we can make melody without strings and pipes. We who do not believe these things to be expedient in worship, lest they should mar its simplicity, don't affirm them to be unlawful. And if any George Herbert or Martin Luther can worship God better by the aid of well-tuned instruments, who shall gainsay they're right? But then he says, we do not need them. They would hinder and help our praise. But if others are otherwise minded, are they not living in gospel liberty? So he takes quite a sort of he's quite open-handed about it. If other people come to different conclusions, that's fine. But for him, he's saying, no, we're living under a different dispensation now. It's the new covenant. There have been some things that have changed. And I guess this is what's interesting when you look at, there's a dividing line here, maybe in terms of people who would take a more Baptistic line, like Spurgeon, and those who would take a more Pedobaptist line, where you'd see more continuity from the Old Testament than typically Credo-Baptists do. So I guess that way of looking at things maybe spills into your view of the regulative principle.
Yeah, definitely. And I think so it's not just about how we, living in the New Testament, as it were, the end times, look back on the Old Testament, and there are a range of views on that, one for another episode, I'm sure. But then there's the view that, are we meant to do exactly as the early church did in Acts? And that here we are 2,000 years later, and we just do everything exactly the same. I'm not entirely sure that's, without wishing to defend tradition on its own, I'm always slightly concerned now that our desire to jettison all tradition to get back to what they really did is part of this thing that we've sort of talked about before, that we just want to go back to year naught and be pure. And there are certain denominations, and it's the that's smacks of Anabaptism.
I think that's quite
the International Church of Christ, those sorts of things, which are going back to, we don't believe in denominations, we don't believe in tradition. We just believe in Scripture. It's like, yeah, but it is 2022. I don't mean to quote the year as an argument, which is very easy to do. It's come on, it's 2022. It's like that doesn't mean anything. But I do mean it's not 33 AD.
No.
Or 38 AD.
But then you've got to ask
AD.
yourself the question, what happened between 33 AD and the medieval church over time? And the reformers would argue there's a whole load of accretions of man-made traditions which have been really unhelpful. And obviously that's what the reform is about. You know, Calvin, the reason that he wanted to remove from church service any element not explicitly mentioned in the Bible was in order to risk any compromise with merely human traditions, and especially those that had accreted in the Roman Catholic Church. And I do have a lot of sympathy with that, because I think left to our own devices, I'm not against tradition per se, but I do think we've got to keep a fairly tight leash on it, because it can easily stray into all kinds of stuff which just seems to then work against the very the very fabric of approaching God in praise and worship. But yeah.
So I would agree with that, but equally, there's always this temptation to run so fast in the other direction,
fall off the horse
that we think we're going to solve all problems by we're just going to go back to what the Bible says. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, we're just going to go back to what the New Testament says. It's like it really isn't that simple, because it's not going to necessarily give you all of the level of detail that you need. You will need to exercise some kind of judgment, as it says in the Westminster Confession 21.1. The acceptable way of worshipping the true God is instituted by himself, and so limited to his own revealed will, that he may not be worshipped according to the imaginations and devices of men, or the suggestion of Satan. Good to put that in. Under any visual representations or any other way not prescribed in the Holy Scripture.
So we kind of agree with that, don't we?
We do.
Yeah.
But there's a sense in which, again, it doesn't... What does the priest wear? Sorry, not priest. What does the preacher wear? Yeah. Well, I was listening to, I think it was Ligon Duncan, who was saying that in the 17th century, they wore a black gown. And that's not because they saw themselves as a priest, but because they saw themselves as teachers, and teachers wore black gowns. So what we would think of as some kind of special costume that the...
marking out a sort of a new Levitical priesthood or something.
Yeah. It's like, no, this person's a teacher, not a gateway.
Yeah. But we don't wear black anymore. Well, teachers don't wear black anymore, unless it's a sort of like a weird emo goth college. So maybe...
So our preachers should preach in sort of...
flip-flops.
Sort of old tweed sports jackets with leather patches on the elbows.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's it.
Cardigans.
I think what I really like about the regulative principle, and I think we're both of a similar mind, that, you know, I could see how it could come off the rails to some extent. But what I do like about it, and what I'm suspicious of when people talk about the normative principle, is that the regulative principle keeps congregations, it seems to me, from falling victim to the whims and the hobby horses of the pastor. You know, and the weirdnesses of the pastor. You know, he can't do whatever he wants in the service, because God has already told us how he would like us to worship him. So we do that. And to me, that seems eminently wise. And I think one of the interesting points I've seen raised on this is that, given that attending a local church regularly is mandated in Scripture and ought to be commended on the conscience of believers, given that, if you like, you've got that captive audience whenever you meet, you shouldn't then bind somebody's conscience to do certain things which Scripture then has not commanded them to do. And I think the regulative principle helps protect congregants in that sense.
And I think the one thing it does is it also tries to stop us from creating a church in our own image.
Right.
And I'm going to say love languages, Barry. Do you have a love language?
Chocolate and what's the other one? Tottenham Hotspur FC.
Okay. So the love language is how you express love or wish others to express love to you.
Yeah.
And there are 5 things which are like little presents, words of affirmation, touch, all that kind of stuff. And I did the test the other day, and it's not particularly.
What are yours?
I can't really remember.
Oh, come on.
But it wasn't. It was a little bit neither one thing nor the other.
Right.
And
I met the author of this book, by the way. He's a lovely chap. I did a conference once with him.
Oh, what, the 5 love languages guy?
Yeah, seems lovely. But anyway, sorry.
It's really good. And oddly, I occasionally mention this when I'm teaching about writing sitcoms, because the one of the things that sitcom characters do, because real people do this, is they love other people in the way in which they wish to be loved.
Yeah, that's right. So
if food really matters to you, you'll go to this great, extravagant, you're at real pains to make this wonderful meal for someone to show them how much you love them. And they're not into food.
Right.
They actually just like to talk, and they'll happily just eat chips. And so you've done this wonderful thing for them, and then you're angry that they're not into it because you've gone to all this trouble. And, I'm sure you've been on the receiving end of this yourself in various stages, where someone's done this wonderful thing for you and you're not into it, and you feel bad for them and they feel cross at you, and you want to say, well, this isn't about you. You've made your thing my thing, and so sitcom characters usually make the problem of trying to solve other people's problems and help other people and love other people in a way that makes total sense to them but not to somebody else. I mention that because we love God, we want to serve him and worship him. Therefore, we think that on a Sunday we should be able to worship God in a way that makes us feel good. We can't see him, so in a way I'm sure he's fine with whatever. And so if I want to just sing and I'm not really that bothered about a sermon, then that's fine. If I want an hour-long sermon and not much music, well, that's fine. Horses for courses. And also, God sees our hearts, Barry. You know this. And surely he knows that I love him. And, so, and yet we sort of know that doesn't, the way, when I put it like that, in this sort of cartoonish way, you think, no, obviously that's not right. But there is that temptation to worship God in a way that we would like to worship him, that we think is appropriate.
Because we are sincere.
I have a real sincere desire for my non-Christian friends to come to Christ. So I'm going to make Sunday morning worship really easy for them. So, I just, the whole love languages thing just made me think of how we like to love God. And because our love is genuine, therefore it must be okay. But actually, we need to be much more careful about worshipping God in the way in which he has said he would like to be worshipped. And although we live in the new covenant, not the old covenant, in the old covenant, God is very specific about the way in which he should and should not be worshipped. But we also see that in the New Testament, let's not forget. So there's that example in 1 Corinthians where Paul says there is drunkenness at the Lord's table, and the result is sickness and death. And so this isn't just a question of preferences. There's more going on here. So, as we look at maybe one or two individual examples, we just need to be mindful of the fact that it really does matter. It's not just a question of personal preference or what makes me feel comfortable.
I think that's exactly right. And if you're somebody who believes in the sufficiency of Scripture, I think some form of the regulative principle kind of naturally follows from that. So, if you believe, as I think most Christians do, although they might not put this tab on it, the idea that the Bible contains all that we need for determining what we must believe and how we're to live before God. It would be weird if God had given us all we need in Scripture for determining how we're to live, but be silent about how we should approach him in worship. And as you say, he's not. But I think the normative principle tends to assume, he hasn't really said much on that. And I just think that, is fatal, really. maybe even literally, if that Bible passage is to be taken like that. Well, shall we look at some specific examples of this? Maybe help put some flesh on the bones of it a bit.
I'd like to use the word nitty-gritty, if I may.
Let's do the nitty-gritty then. James, what do you say to using microphones on a Sunday, and why?
Don't get me started on PowerPoint. We'll come back to that.
Well, that would be a good one to talk about as well.
But in terms of microphones, there's something about elements, forms, and circumstances. Can you just explain what they are?
Yeah, so Reformed Protestants, I'm taking this from the 9 Marks website, but Reformed Protestants traditionally have argued that Scripture requires a limited number of elements. And by elements, we're talking about reading Scripture, preaching, prayer, sung praise, the administration of the sacraments, and oaths, actually, interestingly, if you want to dig into oaths a bit. However, they allowed considerable freedom in regard to the form a given element might take. So an example of that would be, okay, so prayers are a non-negotiable. However, do they have to be written prayers? They would say, well, no, not necessarily. That's a form. So you might be extemporaneous, there might be written prayers, but you've got freedom in that area. And also, there's a third category. You've got elements, you've got forms, you've also got circumstances within which the service takes place. And in that category would fall things like the time you have your service, the seating arrangement, means of voice projections,
and also
lighting, etc.
Whether your steeple has just been blown off by a hurricane, which in the case of St Thomas's in Wales, just literally down the road from me, is an issue. So it's the circumstances is not just the times we live in, but literally the time, and also, I guess, where the rubber's really hit the road in the last couple of years, whether the government have said churches may not meet, and I know a variety of views are available and regularly expressed on our Patreon Discord chat in one of the rooms called COVID, where Barry and I very, very rarely enter, but our brothers and sisters who are Patreons gladly engage with each other as graciously as they can.
That's right.
If you feel like you want to discuss this stuff with Christians, then do join us on Patreon. But we'll mention that again in a moment. But yeah, so we've got elements, we've got forms, we've got circumstances. So a microphone would be forms, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Or
maybe circumstances.
Yeah.
I don't know, but yeah.
Well, so circumstances also reflecting the fact that people live with the expectation of being able to hear.
Well, quite.
And also, if people have hearing aids, we have hearing aid loops. And if you don't use a microphone, then the hearing aid loop doesn't work. And again, I'm just going to go back to this acknowledges the fact that it's not 40 AD or 70 AD or 100 AD. We live in a slightly different world. And if we're going to continue to fill the earth and subdue it and take dominion of the earth and continue to improve things as we, and as the gospel is the yeast that works through the dough, as it were, things are going to be different. But one of the things that is brilliant now is the fact that we have sound systems so everybody can hear. And including people whose hearing is compromised in some way, and they have hearing aids, which in the case of the Church of England is a large percentage of the Anglican worshippers, many of whom are over the age of 65 and therefore likely to have hard of hearing. So yeah, microphones is like, that's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it?
Cooper and T have